Good evening. The case for Somaliland recognition is full of contradiction. The incongruity cannot be measured by the paradox of international diplomacy, but by the yearning of a people. A yearning intensified by the bitter irony of triumph and expectation, followed by disappointment. A yearning heightened by the achievement of peace and democracy, followed by denial of the most basic human rights, the universal and inalienable right to self-determination. Denied not by some tin pot dictatorship, but by the international diplomacy of nations who champion the very values of freedom and democracy. The story of the people of Somaliland and their right to be independent are indivisible. The case for that independence has many facets. It has strong legal merits, as well as moral and natural justice components. Recognition also provides a practical solution for stabilizing the whole region. In presenting the case, I'm going to cover a number of key areas. I'll do my best to keep it as brief and as interesting as possible. So in summary, I will show the legitimacy of Somaliland sovereignty by demonstrating its union with Somalia was technically invalid. I will address the legal issues concerning the separation and annulment of the union. I'm going to refute the false notion that recognition of Somaliland is an infringement of Somalia's territorial integrity. I will establish as fact that even if the union was legally valid, and it was not, there were significant breaches to invalidate it and provide Somaliland with grounds for remedial return to its original sovereign status. I will provide tangible and universally accepted evidence that Somaliland has the attributes of statehood in accordance with internationally accepted standards. I will illustrate the uniqueness of Somaliland's position and the fact its recognition cannot create an applicable precedent to any other region now or at any time in the future. I will demonstrate why ascription of Somaliland sovereignty to a chaotic, lawless nation is detrimental to regional security and a gross injustice to the people of Somaliland. And finally, I'll touch upon other relevant issues such as the merits of recognition on procedural grounds, as well as the pragmatic argument that recognition is the only practical and viable way forward for regional peace and stability. That's the summary of the ground I wish to cover. And so let me start with the substantive issue of territorial integrity. It's impossible to make any pronouncements on Somalia's legitimate territory without a thorough examination of the legal validity of its union with Somaliland. The Act of Union document, which is relied upon as the legal basis for Somali unification, was significantly different to the treaty Somaliland signed and subscribed to. The Act of Union document was retroactively passed some 7 months after the union and fails to meet the required standards for bilateral treaties. There are a number of other reasons a union based on this document is without legal foundation. Among them is the fact that the Unification Treaty produced and signed by Somaliland required the ratification by the Somali National Assembly in Mogadishu. The treaty was never presented to the Assembly and was therefore never ratified. A unification treaty between two states must be signed and executed by both states entering the agreement. It cannot retroactively be passed by one party, as was the case with the Act of Union document. Both treaties were therefore invalid. The first treaty was out of time and in any event without ratification. The second was non-compliant with the original terms and retroactively passed by a single entity. In the absence of a uniting treaty signed by both parties, Neither treaty satisfies the requirements of the Vienna Convention on International Treaties. Without legal validity, such arrangement can only function with the continuing consent of both parties. Somaliland withdrew its consent and thus brought the union to an end. In legal terms, intractable anomalies and treaty ratification errors rendered the union a non-binding revocable arrangement which either party was or is well within its rights to withdraw from. The fact that the union was recognized by the international community, and still is of consequence in the political sense, but does not alter the underlying legal principles. Recognition of Somaliland's independence does not, therefore, encroach on Somalia's sovereignty or territorial integrity. In order to fully appreciate the case, it's necessary to provide some historic context which will help the application and understanding of other legal contentions I'm going to make. It will also serve to put the reasons and rationale for withdrawing from the Union into better all-round perspective. In 1960, an independent Somaliland entered into a voluntary union with the Italian-administered UN trusteeship of Somalia to form the Somali Republic. 9 years later, in 1969, the civilian government of the two amalgamated states was overthrown by a military coup led by General Mohammed Siad Barre. Somaliland joined the Union as an equal partner, but the military dictatorship implemented a policy of discrimination and clear socio-economic bias against Somaliland and its people. This was followed in very short order by the creation of a repressive totalitarian government where the state apparatus and secret police controlled almost every aspect of people's lives. Civil freedoms were curtailed. Illegal detentions, torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial executions became a commonplace. Disquieted the inequality and repression among the northern Somaliland clans resulted in the regime's systematic and wholesale persecution of these groups. Students and prominent figures from these clans were among the first to be targeted. The crimes against the civilian population in the north were so egregious they led to resistance, armed rebellion, and the creation of the Somali National Movement, the SNM. In response, the regime declared a state of emergency, imposed curfews, and put in place other draconian measures, such as travel bans and border closures. It also gave its army, militias, and secret police a free rein to extort, rape, and pillage. The repression and cruelty was therefore psychological as well as physical. As the regime's squeeze on the north increased, so did SNM resistance. Desperate to stay in power and maintain control, in 1988, the regime ordered the extermination of the largest clan groups in Somaliland. In a surreal but a barbaric act of treachery, Somali Air Force fighter jets took off from Hargeisa Airport and bombed densely populated areas of the same city, the city from which they had taken off. It was total decimation. It was a bloodbath. Simultaneous attacks were mounted against the civilian populations of Bur'o, Berbera, and Erigabo as the cities lay siege to ferocious and sustained artillery bombardment. The result was carnage. This was a war crime, a crime against humanity, a genocide. An estimated 50,000 innocent civilians lost their lives. At least 500,000 were displaced. The desire to unite with the South and the aspiration for a greater Somalia had led to ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's important to note the international community passively stood by and turned a blind eye, whilst these crimes were being committed. The targeting and brutalization of the largest clans in Somaliland distinguished them as a people in the context of international law in respect to the right to self-determination. This means that by defining a people with an undeniable shared characteristic, like clan affiliation, and persecuting them, the Somali state, through its actions, created the legal entitlement of a people's remedial right to self-determination and therefore independence. Even prior to these massacres, the fact that the regime denied the people of Somaliland civil, political and human rights is sufficient in itself to invalidate the Union under international law. The right to self-determination of a colonized people would therefore revert back to the people of Somaliland. After the Somali state's attempted annihilation of a people, the SNM and the population in the north faced a simple choice: victory or extermination. It was victory. The regime's conscript army was routed, the dictator lost the war in the north, and Somaliland was under the control of the SNM. In other parts of the country, the regime was in free fall, and in Mogadishu, the USC and other groups seized their opportunity and captured the capital. The regime fell, and the dictator and his inner circle fled the city. Now, despite the fact that the capture of the north and the long war of attrition with the SNM led to the regime's downfall, the USC, without any consultation with the SNM or the people of Somaliland, declared itself as the new government of Somalia. In Somaliland, this hasty and presumptuous decision was viewed with hostility and served as a clear example why the ideologically driven union had failed in the first place. The self-proclamation of the USC as the new government reinforced the untenable nature of the union. This was instrumental in Somaliland's decision to revoke the union and declare itself as an independent state within its pre-union boundaries. The decision was representative of public sentiment and enjoyed support from all constituencies, the overwhelming support from all constituencies and clan groups. For these reasons, the decision to revoke the union was a legitimate assertion of a people's inalienable right to self-determination, a fundamental human right protected by international law. I must emphasize the recognition grounds I have thus far covered demonstrate a withdrawal from a voluntary union and not secession. I believe I have established that a de jure union did not exist, but rather a haphazard arrangement without legal foundation. But even if we set aside the legal invalidity of the union and the lack of civil, political and human rights, even if we set aside the genocide and the claim of the remedial right to self-determination of a persecuted people, there remains a further ground under international law which provides the people of Somaliland the right to self-determination and therefore independence. And that's the right to secession on procedural grounds. Eminent scholars such as Antonello Tancredi concur that international law addresses the procedure of secession, not just whether it substantively occurs. In his excellent paper, The Right to Secede Under International Law, Peter Rothke summarized Tancredi's view that the three procedural criteria must be met for international law to legitimate secession. First, the secession must occur without military aid from foreign states. Second, the population of the seceding territory must democratically approve the secession. And third, the secession must respect the principle of iutai possidetis. Somaliland satisfies this universally accepted three-point criteria in that first, the SNM defeated the Siad Barre regime in Somaliland without external help. Second, the 2001 Somaliland referendum provided the democratic mandate. And third, the principle of iutai possidetis was respected with the maintenance of the pre-union boundaries. Moreover, the Somaliland government's 24-year control, administration and protection of its territory now applies that principle of Iutai Posidetis in favour of the people of Somaliland. Now, since reasserting its independence in 1991, Somaliland's achievements have been nothing short of a miracle. Democratic state institutions such as a parliament and an independent judiciary have been established. In 2001, despite meagre financial resources, Somaliland held a referendum on a new constitution. The referendum included the introduction of a multi-party system and the proposition to formally dissolve the union with Somalia. 66% of eligible voters participated, and a resounding 97% of voters supported the new constitution. Somaliland has established its own currency and central bank. An independent electoral commission has been created, and since the new constitution, there has been a smooth and seamless transition of power of 3 presidents, the last in July 2010, when the leader of the opposition and the current incumbent was elected to office. There have been 2 internationally observed presidential elections. Municipal and parliamentary elections have taken place, and international and local observers have deemed and declared all of Somaliland's elections as free and fair. Indeed, on the 7th of July 2010, in the House of Commons, no other than British Prime Minister David Cameron said, and I quote, "I welcome the peaceful and credible elections in Somaliland. It's an example of a genuine democracy in an area of the world not noted for it." End quote. This is a tremendous achievement for a fledgling democracy deprived of international recognition and therefore access to the IMF, World Bank, and assistance from other multilateral organizations. On this subject, the South African Department of Foreign Affairs issued a legal opinion which stated, quote, "It's undeniable that Somaliland does indeed qualify for statehood, and it's incumbent on the international community to recognize it. Any efforts to deny or delay would not only put the international community at risk of ignoring the most stable region in the Horn, it would impose untold hardship upon the people of Somaliland due to the denial of foreign assistance that recognition entails. The extraordinary progress made by the Somaliland government is in stark contrast to its southern Somali neighbors. Despite billions of dollars worth of military and financial assistance, successive interim and transitional governments have failed to deliver security and stability in the capital Mogadishu alone, let alone other parts of the country. As a consequence, the population in the south have suffered starvation, displacement, and unnecessary hardship, caused in part by the scourge of armed bandits, only to be replaced by even a worse menace, whose warped interpretation of Islam is an aberration of a religion which teaches peace and the sanctity of human life. Now, since the regime's downfall, Somalia has been turbulent and by and large lawless. The United Nations and international community have organized a host of conferences and peace initiatives aimed at ending the anarchy and building stability. But despite its de facto independence and democratic credentials, such initiatives have marginalized Somaliland in favor of a top-down Mogadishu government. At these conferences, the position towards Somaliland has been to participate as a province or a region, or to engage with the government of Somalia. Engage with which government of Somalia? Since the downfall of the dictator, there has been no directly elected government with a real democratic mandate. On the contrary, there has been a procession of power-hungry factions. So-called government institutions have been inseparable from the larger-than-life personalities. The result has been a fractious culture and introvert transitional governments unable to control territory or command public support. And whilst there have undoubtedly been serious challenges and post-conflict difficulties, the fact that Somaliland has recovered from an arguably worse situation with considerably less international assistance provides a compelling narrative and is a good source for a comparative analysis. Now, I don't deny the genuine goodwill and commitment of the international community, and it would be fair to say that since his appointment in June 2013, the UN head of mission, Nicholas K., has made good progress. Nevertheless, the Groundhog Day type of recurrent, never-ending transitional governments serve only to postpone the moment of truth. The moment of truth when real direct democracy must be attempted. The effort to prop up and sustain these transitional entities has not yielded the desired results. The fact that Mogadishu is still one of the most dangerous cities on earth is testament to this reality. As stated by its leadership, Somaliland supports the international community's efforts to establish a stable democratic government in Somalia, within its pre-union boundaries, of course. The wish to see its southern Somali brethren enjoy the same peace and security is a sincere inbred instinct of the people of Somaliland and their government. It's a no-brainer. It's in their best interests. Nevertheless, the international community's policy which subjugates Somaliland under an arguably non-existent Somali state is unhelpful and unjust. Stable democracies are built from the foundation, from the grassroots. This is the Somaliland model. Attempting to build anything on a shaky foundation will inevitably lead to collapse and disaster. The current policy fixated at prioritizing on a Mogadishu government is fundamentally flawed and one of the reasons for years of failed intervention in Somalia. A synchronous and proportionally equal two-state approach is the answer which provides a solid foundation from which to build regional peace and stability. A policy which acknowledges the irrevocable nature of the Union and consolidates on Somaliland's remarkable progress by formally recognizing its sovereignty will yield greater dividends and enhance the prospect of peace and democracy throughout the region. In June 2013, the head of the United Nations mission, Nicholas K., visited Somaliland and said, "Somaliland has remained an island of relative peace and stability in an insecure region. And we believe there are lessons to be learned about building stability in the whole region." Mr. K's comments support the argument for recognition of Somaliland on procedural grounds. Theodore Christakis, Professor of International Law and Director at the Center of International Security at the University of Grenoble, states, quote, "If a secessionist entity succeeds in fulfilling the conditions of statehood, a new state is born. The conditions of statehood are defined by Article 1 of the 1933 Montevideo Convention. Somaliland fulfills these conditions in that it has a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. It has such relations with many countries around the world, including the United States, Denmark, the United Kingdom, and Ethiopia. So in addition to the invalidity of the Union and the existence of the right to self-determination on remedial grounds, recognition is also viable on procedural grounds. All of the legal grounds I have presented are compelling under international law. So what's the problem? Well, self-interests and outdated policies appear to be the biggest obstacle to Somaliland recognition. States selectively apply international law depending on their priorities and beliefs, even if those beliefs are outdated or no longer relevant. Many nations doggedly follow outdated policies formulated decades ago at the fall of the former dictator. Revisiting and reviewing such policies to take stock of the new regional realities would yield significantly more successful strategies and outcomes. Somaliland promotes regional peace and stability and punches well above its weight in combating piracy and extremism. It's among the safest and most stable nations in East Africa, but in a volatile region, recognition of its sovereignty is the only way to safeguard that stability. Security in the Horn of Africa is inextricably linked to global security. The international community has a vested self-interest in countering and containing international terrorism. Leaving Somaliland in a state of limbo is not conducive to achieving those objectives. At a turbulent time of extremist ideology and war with the likes of ISIS, Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, full international support, which entails recognition, is the only practical and viable way forward. Inaction in this regard may tantamount to conceding ground to the radical elements which frequent the region. And while Somaliland will do everything in its power to protect its people and territory, there are new challenges and changing dynamics, and it's incumbent on the international community to respond and adapt to those challenges. Simply maintaining the status quo of the same old policy could come to haunt the international community for years, if not decades to come. Now we understand the reluctance caused by the concern in some quarters of the international community that recognition of Somaliland could establish a precedent and may encourage other claims of independence. It's unfounded. The circumstances of Somaliland's claim for recognition are so unique they can never be replicated now or at any time in the future. There are simply no two other nations on the planet that have entered into a voluntary union or are in a similar predicament. The issues of an invalid union, the rights to self-determination on remedial and procedural grounds, as well as a 24-year track record of democracy and independence do not exist anywhere else and will not exist anywhere else, now or at any time in the future. For these reasons, recognition of Somaliland will not set a comparable precedent which can apply to any future claims of independence. The Horn of Africa is not the Balkans, where the dominant power was willing to wage war to resist the human rights of others. On the contrary, Somaliland is the dominant and better organized of the two Somali states, but a peaceful dominance focused on self-improvement and the pursuit of its people's universal and inalienable rights. Obviously, once recognition of its sovereignty is secure, Somaliland will be in a position to contribute to support its neighbor with its vast nation-building experience and know-how. Experience which is relevant and transferable, particularly as the two states share a common heritage, religion, language, and culture.